Eric and I have always been the kind of guys who don't mind taking small risks. Traveling with no money, sleeping at gas stations, hitchhiking with strangers. It was our thing. The road seemed darker than usual, the wind was sharp and cold, and the silence around us was suffocating. We had been walking for miles without seeing a single living soul, and the thought of spending the night by the roadside was starting to sink in. So when the headlights of an old car appeared in the distance, we almost cheered. The car was an old, rusty sedan, but it seemed to run fine. The driver was a skinny man with sunken eyes and a weird smile, like he was forcing himself to look friendly. He didn't ask much, just opened the door and motioned for us to get in. I hesitated for a second, but Eric, as always, jumped in without thinking, dragging me along. The smell inside hit me immediately, a mix of sweat, damp soil, and something metallic, almost like rust. Old legends, things no one had asked about. I figured he was just a lonely weirdo looking for someone to talk to. Nothing too unusual, right? We drove for a while, the headlights cutting through the empty road like we were the only ones left in the world. At first, it wasn't too bad. The guy rambled about folklore, curses, and full moons, stuff that Eric found hilarious. He kept nudging me, whispering jokes under his breath. I laughed a little, but something about the way the driver spoke made my skin crawl. He wasn't just telling stories, he sounded like he believed every word. His fingers tapped the wheel in an anxious rhythm, and every now and then he'd glance at us in the rearview mirror, his eyes lingering a little too long. Then I noticed the smell getting stronger, not just the sweat and damp soil, but something deeper, almost like rotting meat. I shifted uncomfortably and turned my head, trying to ignore it. That's when I saw them chains. Thick, rusted chains coiled on the floor behind the driver's seat. At first, I thought they were just junk, but then I saw the worn-out latch on the passenger door, the scratches near the handle. Like someone had tried to get out. My stomach twisted. I nudged Eric subtly, trying not to make it obvious, but he was too busy smirking at the driver's ramblings to notice. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself I was overthinking things. Maybe the chains were for something else, cargo, repairs, whatever. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. The back seat had deep scratches on the leather, like something or someone had been clawing at it. My breathing got shallow and my hands felt clammy. I wanted to tell Eric, but I didn't want to set the guy off. His fingers were gripping the wheel tighter now, his knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. Then the radio crackled. A burst of static filled the car, sharp and sudden, making me flinch. The driver didn't react right away, he just stared ahead, his jaw tight. Then, in that same low, raspy voice, he asked, "Do you know what happens when the moon rises?" His tone was different now, not casual, not chatty, just cold. I looked at Eric, finally seeing the realization sink into his face. His smirk was gone. He had noticed it too, the chains, the scratches, the driver's sharpened teeth barely visible when he spoke. That's when I knew. We were trapped in a speeding car with someone or something that wasn't just a lonely traveler. Eric finally got it. His whole posture changed. He wasn't leaning back anymore, all relaxed and cocky. He was stiff, his eyes darting from the driver to the door handle, probably realizing the same thing I had. I swallowed hard and tried to keep my voice steady. "Where exactly are you heading?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. The driver didn't answer right away. He just smiled, that weird stretched grin that made my stomach twist. "Somewhere quiet," he finally said. "Away from the noise." His fingers tapped the wheel again, faster this time. I glanced at the speedometer. He was picking up speed. The trees outside blurred into streaks of black, and the road stretched endlessly ahead. No towns, no exits, just darkness. Eric shifted slightly, his hand moving toward his pocket. The problem was, the driver kept watching us in the mirror, like he was waiting for something, testing us. I tried to think, to plan, but my mind was racing too fast. Every instinct in me screamed that we had to get out of that car, but at this speed? He wanted us to feel trapped. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, and the smell of sweat and rust was making me nauseous. Eric cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. "Man, think you could slow down a bit? We're not in a hurry or anything." The driver didn't even blink. "You should be," he muttered. His voice was lower now, almost a growl. That's when I saw his fingers. His nails were dirty blackened, thick, but that wasn't the worst part. They looked longer, like they had grown since we got in the car. I stared at them, my chest tightening as a horrible thought sank in. We're not riding with a man. I felt Eric tense beside me, and I knew he had noticed too. Eric and I locked eyes for a split second, the same thought running through both our heads. We need to get out now. But the car was moving too fast, and the driver was getting more unhinged by the second. His fingers twitched on the wheel, his nails curling slightly like claws. The radio crackled again, a sharp burst of static, and then something else. A low, guttural sound, like a growl buried beneath the white noise. I reached for the door handle as casually as I could, my fingers trembling. I pulled. Nothing. The lock wouldn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but it was useless. The latch was broken. That's why the scratches were there. Someone else had tried to get out before us, and failed. The driver let out a slow breath, almost like a sigh. "People always try," he said, like he could read my thoughts. His voice was different now, deeper, rougher. His grin widened, and for the first time I saw them, his teeth. They were too sharp, too uneven, like they had been worn down from biting. My stomach dropped. Eric reacted first. He lunged forward, yanking at the steering wheel. The car swerved violently, tires screeching against the pavement. The driver snarled, actually snarled, and lashed out, his arm moving too fast, too strong. Eric crashed against the dashboard with a grunt of pain. I barely had time to register it before the car skidded off the road. The impact was brutal. The car slammed into something, a ditch, a rock. I don't know, but the force sent me crashing forward, my forehead smacking against the seat in front of me. Pain exploded in my skull, but I barely had time to process it before the whole world tilted. The car flipped. I remember the feeling of weightlessness, my body lifting from the seat as metal crunched and glass shattered around us. It felt like forever, like we were tumbling through a black void. When we finally hit the ground again, the car landed on its side with a sickening thud. Everything went silent except for the ringing in my ears and the distant hum of the radio still playing, just static now. I coughed, tasting blood in my mouth. My vision blurred, but I could see Eric groaning, trying to push himself up. The driver, though, he wasn't groaning, he was laughing. Low, raspy, almost amused. And then, slowly, I heard the sound of bones cracking, stretching. I turned my head just in time to see him moving, changing. His limbs twisted unnaturally, his shoulders hunching forward, his spine rippling under his skin like something inside was breaking free. His fingers curled, nails splitting as they lengthened into something wrong, and his eyes, Jesus, his eyes glowed. Not with reflection, not from the headlights, they burned in the darkness. That's when I knew. The stories he had been telling weren't just folklore, they were warnings. Eric was struggling to move, one hand clutching his side, probably hurt from the crash. My whole body ached, but fear pushed me forward. I reached for him, trying to help him up, but my eyes kept darting back to the driver, or whatever the hell he was now. His body kept twisting, the sound of his bones cracking echoing through the wreckage. His clothes tore as his frame expanded, his arms lengthening unnaturally. The glow in his eyes burned brighter. Eric saw it too. "Run," he gasped, shoving me toward the shattered windshield. I didn't argue. My hands scrambled against broken glass as I pulled myself out, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed. I just knew we had to get as far from that car as possible. Eric struggled behind me, dragging himself out, gasping in pain. We barely made it a few feet before we heard a deep, guttural growl that seemed to rumble from beneath the earth itself. I turned back just in time to see him, not a man anymore, not even close. His face had elongated, his mouth stretched into something not human. His teeth gleamed in the dark, long and jagged like a predator's. His hands or claws now dug into the dirt as he crouched, ready to pounce. And then he spoke, but it wasn't a voice anymore. It was something inhuman, layered, guttural. "You should have stayed in the car," Eric and I bolted. It didn't matter how much pain we were in, our bodies moved on pure survival instinct. The road was too far, the trees too dense, but we had no choice. We sprinted into the dark, branches slashing at our arms and faces as we pushed through the thick undergrowth. Behind us, we heard the crunch of metal, the rip of fabric, and then that growl. It was closer, too close. Eric stumbled, letting out a sharp cry as he hit the ground hard. I turned back, reaching for him, my breath ragged. "Get up, get up!" I hissed, yanking him up by his jacket. His face was pale, twisted in pain, but he forced himself to move. We didn't have time to stop. Then the sound changed. No more footsteps, just breathing, heavy, deep, almost laughing. And then, from the shadows, the voice came again, but it wasn't coming from one place. It echoed, like it was circling us. "You think you can run?" A twig snapped behind us. My stomach dropped. I turned my head just in time to see a blur of movement. Something lunged from the trees, something too fast, too big. Claws swiped through the air, just missing Eric's back. We barely dodged it, crashing through the brush, running blindly. The forest was a maze, but we had no choice but to keep moving. Then, up ahead, I saw it, a break in the trees, a road, a chance. But that's when I heard it. the sound of something landing right behind us. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it, its breath on my neck, the weight of its presence pressing down like a physical force. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but the road was right there, just a few more steps. Then Eric screamed. I skidded to a stop, my heart slamming against my ribs. Eric was on the ground, his ankle twisted, his face twisted in agony. "Go," he gasped, trying to push himself up. But before he could move, a clawed hand, no, a massive, gnarled paw wrapped around his leg and yanked him back into the dirt. I lunged forward, grabbing his arms, pulling with everything I had. "No, no, no." The creature snarled, a deep, primal sound that made every hair on my body stand up. Its eyes glowed like embers, its mouth curled into something that was almost a grin. "Mine," Eric thrashed, kicking wildly, his fingers clawing at the dirt. I wouldn't let go. I couldn't, but the thing was so strong. It pulled again, and Eric's scream tore through the night as his body was dragged backward. His nails scraped the earth, leaving deep trails in the mud. I had seconds, just seconds to act, and then headlights. A pair of blinding golden beams flooded the forest edge, the roar of an engine slicing through the chaos. A car was coming, fast. For a split second, the creature hesitated, just long enough. With every ounce of strength left in me, I yanked Eric forward, his body lurching toward me. The moment he was loose, I threw him toward the road. "Move!" We stumbled, nearly collapsing, but we didn't stop. The second we hit the pavement, I waved my arms wildly, screaming like a madman. "Stop! Please stop!" The car skidded, tires screeching. The driver barely had time to react before we crashed into the hood, pounding on it, begging for help, and then silence. I turned back, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was empty. The thing, whatever it was gone. Not a single trace left. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the trees, still and silent, as if nothing had ever been there. The driver, an old man with wide, terrified eyes, leaned out of his window. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "What the hell happened to you boys?" I opened my mouth. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to explain. But no words came out, because the truth was, I didn't know. I still don't.